Vivian, if you marry this homeless man, don't ever call me your father again.
Dad, money can buy houses, but it can't buy the kind of heart Daniel has.
Look at him! He has nothing! No name!
Sir, you're right. I have nothing. If loving your daughter means walking away, I'll disappear forever.
No! Daniel, don't leave me! I'd rather lose everything than lose the only man who has ever truly loved me.
You'll regret this for the rest of your life.
Vivian Calloway stands in a narrow hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, still wearing yesterday's clothes, her hands wrapped around a folded, worn blueprint that does not belong to her, its edges soft from years of handling by someone else. Fluorescent light hums overhead, harsh and unkind, and somewhere beyond the door in front of her, she hears her father's voice, low, certain, final, the kind of certainty that has never once needed to raise itself to be obeyed. She will thank me for this one day, Richard Calloway says to someone she cannot see, even if she hates me for it tonight. Vivian does not move. She does not breathe. She only tightens her grip on the blueprint, because somewhere inside that folded paper is the truth her father has spent 30 years trying to keep buried. And somewhere behind that door is a decision that is about to cost her everything she has ever called home. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Vivian Calloway ended up standing in that corridor at 2 in the morning, we have to go back nearly a year to a version of her life that looked, from the outside, like something most people would never dare complain about. She was 34 years old, the only child of Richard Calloway, a man who had built a modest hardware store into Calloway Retail Group, a company with locations in 11 states and a name recognized in every American suburb with a strip mall. Vivian had grown up in a house with more bathrooms than people, had gone to schools where her last name opened doors before she ever had to knock, and had spent her entire adult life being groomed, carefully and without her consent, to inherit an empire she had never once been asked whether she actually wanted. Her mother, Margaret Calloway, had died 9 years earlier, and the version of Richard who existed after that loss was not the same man who had existed before it. Before Margaret's death, Richard had been protective the way most successful fathers are protective, insistent on good schools, careful about who Vivian dated, occasionally overbearing but never suffocating. After the funeral, something in him closed like a fist and never fully opened again. He began making decisions on Vivian's behalf without asking her opinion first, not out of cruelty, but out of a grief so large he could not find any other way to carry it except by controlling every variable in the one life he had left to protect. He told himself, every single time, that he was simply making sure she never experienced the kind of sudden, unbearable loss that had gutted him the year her mother died. Vivian understood this about her father, even as it exhausted her, and she had learned, over 9 years, to build a second life quietly underneath the one everyone believed she was living. Twice a week, she left the Calloway estate in ordinary clothes, drove a plain, unremarkable car she kept parked 2 blocks from the house, and volunteered at a community kitchen on the east side of the city under a name that was not her own. The regulars there called her V, a name she had chosen for herself the first week she started, and inside those walls, ladling soup and stacking donated cans, she felt something she almost never felt at her father's galas, which was that people liked her before they knew what she was worth on paper. It was on an ordinary Tuesday evening, cold enough that her breath fogged in front of her as she carried a crate of canned vegetables through the kitchen's back door, that she first noticed the man fixing a broken shopping cart wheel for one of the older regulars, a woman named Miss Ruthie, who came in every week for a hot meal and a few minutes of company. He was crouched on the concrete, sleeves pushed up despite the cold, working the wheel loose with a patience that seemed entirely unbothered by how long it was taking him, murmuring something reassuring to Miss Ruthie that made her laugh for the first time all evening. Vivian did not know his name yet. She only knew that something about the steadiness of his hands made her stop walking for a moment longer than she meant to. His name, she would learn a few days later from one of the kitchen's longtime volunteers, an older man named Walter who had seen most of the regulars come and go over the years, was Daniel Reyes. He was 38, quiet in a way that read as dignity rather than shyness, and he had been coming to the kitchen for meals for close to 2 years, though he never asked for anything beyond what was offered and always found some small way to help before he left, fixing a cartwheel, tightening a loose door hinge, carrying supplies in from a delivery truck without being asked. Walter mentioned, almost in passing, that Daniel had once had a real career, something technical, something that had ended badly, though nobody at the kitchen knew the full story and nobody pushed him to tell it. Vivian found herself, over the following weeks, arriving at the kitchen earlier than her shift required, finding small reasons to linger near whatever task Daniel happened to be doing. A crate that needed carrying, a shelf that needed organizing, excuses that neither of them examined too closely, because examining them might have required naming what was actually happening between two people who had decided, without discussing it, that noticing each other quietly felt safer than admitting what that noticing might eventually become. Daniel, for his part, began arriving on the same evening she did, though neither of them ever said so directly, and Walter, watching the pattern develop over several weeks, kept his observations to himself the way people do when they suspect something delicate is happening and don't want to be the one to disturb it. It was during one of these evenings, as the kitchen was closing and most of the volunteers had already gone home, that Vivian finally asked Daniel the question she had been circling for weeks, careful and a little clumsy, about what he had done before he came to the kitchen so often. Daniel considered the question for a long moment before answering. The way she would come to learn, he considered most questions worth answering honestly. He told her he had been a structural engineer, that he had spent over a decade designing supports for bridges and public buildings, and that 2 years earlier, a bridge he had worked on had suffered a partial support failure during a routine inspection, no injuries, but enough damage that someone needed to be blamed publicly and quickly, and the company he worked for had decided that someone would be him. He said it without self-pity, without performance, the way a man speaks when he has made a kind of peace with a decision he never actually made himself. He told her he had spent the following months fighting the internal investigation, insisting the materials used on that section of the project had been substituted at the last minute by someone above his authority, a cost-cutting decision made without his knowledge or approval, but that no one with the power to overturn the finding had been willing to reopen a case that had already been quietly closed. He lost his license within the year, lost the apartment soon after, and lost, eventually, most of the people who had called themselves his friends when his paycheck was still coming in reliably every 2 weeks. Vivian listened to all of this without saying much, because she understood, instinctively, that a man like Daniel did not need her sympathy performed loudly. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complicated, a recognition that both of them, in entirely different ways, had spent years being defined by decisions other people made about their lives without ever fully asking them what they wanted. She did not tell him, that night, who her father was. She told herself it was because it wasn't relevant yet, though some quieter, more honest part of her understood she was avoiding it because she liked, for the first time and longer than she could remember, being seen as simply V, a woman who showed up twice a week to ladle soup, rather than the only heir to Calloway Retail Group. While Vivian was building this quiet second life on the east side of the city, Richard Calloway was moving forward with plans of his own, plans he had not yet shared with his daughter directly, but had been discussing at length with his closest advisors for months. Calloway Retail Group was preparing for a major public offering, one that would require, in the eyes of the board, a visible sense of stability at the top of the family that had built it. Richard had come to believe, with the same absolute conviction he brought to every major business decision, that Vivian's marriage to the right man would communicate exactly the kind of permanence investors needed to see, and he had already settled, in his own mind, on the man he believed fit that role perfectly. That man was Preston Hale, 41 years old, Calloway Retail's chief operating officer, a man who had risen through the company over more than a decade with a precision and charm that had made him a favorite of the board long before Richard ever considered him for anything beyond the office. Preston filled a room the moment he walked into it, quick with a joke, quicker with a compliment, comfortable in exactly the kind of high-pressure boardroom environment Vivian had grown up inside without ever fully belonging to. On paper, he looked like exactly the partner a man like Richard would choose for his only daughter, disciplined, ambitious, already trusted with the operational future of the family's entire fortune. What Richard did not know, and would not discover until much further into this story, was that underneath Preston's easy confidence sat a mounting pile of private financial obligations he had spent years concealing from nearly everyone around him. Investments that had gone badly wrong and debts that had grown quietly unmanageable, serious enough that a marriage into the Calloway fortune had become, for Preston, less a professional opportunity and more a lifeline he intended to secure by whatever means the situation eventually required. He had already begun, in small and careful ways, positioning himself as the obvious choice for Vivian's hand, flattering Richard at every opportunity, making himself indispensable in every meeting where Vivian's future came up, even in passing. Richard called Vivian into his study on a Sunday afternoon in early spring and informed her, in the same measured tone he might use to announce a quarterly earnings report, that he had been in serious conversation with Preston about a future together, and that he believed, given everything at stake for the company in the coming year, an engagement announcement within the next several months would serve everyone's best interests. He framed it, as he always framed these things, as an opportunity rather than an order, though Vivian understood, the way she always understood her father's careful phrasing, that very little about the conversation had ever been designed to include her actual opinion. She asked him, quietly, whether he intended to keep making these decisions for her indefinitely. His answer, delivered without cruelty but without room for argument, was that he had spent his entire life building something worth protecting, and that he needed to know whoever eventually stood beside her could carry that weight alongside her. Vivian left that study feeling something she had felt many times before in her father's presence, a familiar tightening in her chest that came from being loved deeply and controlled completely by the same person at the same time. She drove that same evening to the community kitchen, arriving earlier than her shift required, and found Daniel repairing a jammed lock on the kitchen supply closet, his sleeves rolled up, a small metal pick working patiently at the mechanism the way he approached every small broken thing that crossed his path. She did not tell him about the conversation with her father. She only stayed later than usual that night, helping him long after the actual work was finished, neither of them quite ready to say good night to an evening that had, without either of them naming it, started to feel like something worth protecting. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We would genuinely love to hear from you. And if you have not yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because the announcement Richard Calloway was preparing to make about his daughter's future was about to collide directly with a truth Vivian had been quietly building for months. And neither man in her life yet understood how completely that collision was about to reshape everything. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither Vivian nor Daniel fully acknowledged out loud, though both of them noticed it happening with the same quiet certainty. She began arriving at the kitchen not twice a week, but 3 times, then 4, finding smaller and smaller excuses to be near wherever he happened to be working. Daniel, for his part, began noticing the particular sound of her car pulling into the lot before he consciously registered why he was listening for it at all. Walter, the longtime volunteer who had first told her Daniel's name, mentioned once, arranging canned goods on a shelf beside her, that in his considerable years watching people pass through that kitchen, he had rarely seen two people circle each other so carefully for so long without either of them simply saying what was obvious to everyone else in the room. It was on one of these later evenings, after the kitchen had closed and most of the volunteers had gone home, that Daniel finally asked Vivian the question he had been circling just as carefully as she had been circling her own silence. He asked her, gently, what she actually did during the daylight hours, since she had never once mentioned a job, a family, or anything at all about the life she lived outside those doors. Vivian felt her chest tighten in the way it always did whenever this exact moment approached, and she told him, finally, the truth she had been avoiding for months, that her last name was Calloway, that her father owned one of the largest retail companies in the country, and that she had been coming to that kitchen under a false name because it was the only place in her life where people had ever liked her before learning what she was worth. Daniel did not react the way she had feared he might, with sudden distance or performed excitement about her family's fortune. He sat with the information quietly for a long moment, studying her face the way he studied everything, carefully, without judgment, and told her that it explained a few things about her he had noticed but never quite understood, a certain watchfulness in the way she moved through rooms, as though she had spent her whole life being observed and had learned to observe herself the same way before anyone else could. He told her it did not change how he saw her, that the woman who had spent months helping him stock shelves and repair broken things was the same woman regardless of what name appeared on her birth certificate. And Vivian, hearing this, felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in longer than she could remember. It was that same week that Richard Calloway's plans for Vivian's engagement to Preston Hale accelerated far faster than she had anticipated, driven by pressure from the board ahead of the company's public offering. Richard called Vivian into his study again, this time with Preston present, and informed her that he intended to make a formal announcement at the company's upcoming spring gala, a black tie event attended by every major investor and board member with a stake in Calloway Retail's future. He framed the timeline, as he always framed these things, as a matter of necessity rather than choice, and Preston, seated beside him, offered Vivian a smile that struck her, for the first time, as something closer to a performance than genuine affection. Vivian left that meeting and drove straight to the kitchen, arriving so much earlier than her usual shift that Daniel noticed something was wrong before she had said a single word. She told him everything, the gala, the announcement, the timeline that had suddenly compressed her entire future into a single evening she had no real say in shaping. Daniel listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he told her simply that he understood, better than most people ever could, what it felt like to have your life narrated by someone else's decisions, and that whatever she chose to do next, he would understand if it meant she needed to step back from a friendship that could never survive contact with the world she actually belonged to. Vivian told him, with a certainty that surprised even her, that she did not want to step back, that the last several months at that kitchen had been the only honest thing in her entire life, and that she was tired of building her happiness around what other people believed she was worth. It was in that moment, standing beside a supply closet Daniel had repaired weeks earlier, that they shared their first real acknowledgement of what had been growing quietly between them for months, not a grand declaration, but a simple, steady understanding that neither of them wanted to walk away from whatever this had become. Daniel took her hand, carefully, the way he did everything, and told her that whatever came next, he intended to be honest with her about it, the same way he wished someone had once been honest with him. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. We would love to hear from you, and if this story already has its hooks in you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because the spring gala where Richard Calloway intended to announce his daughter's engagement to Preston Hale was about to become the exact place where everything he had planned started to fall apart. The gala took place on a clear April evening, the Calloway estate lit gold under strings of hanging lights, valets working the long circular drive, as one expensive car after another pulled up to deliver board members, investors, and old family friends dressed for an evening everyone understood was more business transaction than celebration. Vivian arrived dressed exactly the way her father expected her to dress, elegant, correct, without any particular enthusiasm, and she caught her own reflection in a hallway mirror on her way to the terrace looking, she thought privately, like a woman arriving at her own sentencing rather than her own engagement party. Richard moved through the crowd the way he moved through every room he had ever entered, greeting donors and board members with the easy confidence of a man who had built the very ground beneath their feet. Preston arrived shortly after, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, greeting guests with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned, over many years, exactly which words made powerful people feel comfortable in his presence. He found Vivian near the terrace railing and complimented her dress, her composure, the entire evening itself, with a smoothness that felt to her, more than ever before, like a performance rehearsed for many different rooms rather than anything specific to the woman standing in front of him. What Vivian did not witness that evening, because it happened in a separate room entirely, was a brief, tense phone call Preston stepped away to take just before dinner, his voice dropping into something sharper and more urgent than anything he had shown at the terrace. Addressed to a man on the other end of the line demanding payment on an obligation Preston had spent nearly 2 years trying to keep hidden from everyone who mattered to his career. Richard took the small podium set up on the terrace shortly after dinner, glass raised, and began the speech Vivian had known was coming for weeks, praising Preston's contributions to the company, praising the strength a united family brought to an uncertain market, building steadily toward the announcement she had been dreading since the moment he first mentioned it in his study. But before he could finish the sentence that would have formally announced her engagement to a man she had never actually agreed to marry, Vivian stepped forward, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her, and told the gathered crowd that she needed a moment before her father continued, because there was something everyone in that room deserved to hear directly from her rather than filtered through a plan built entirely without her. The terrace went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone senses, all at once, that something unscripted is about to happen. Vivian told the crowd, calmly and without apology, that she had not agreed to marry Preston Hale, that the engagement her father was about to announce existed only in his own careful planning, and that she intended, from that evening forward, to make her own decisions about her own future, regardless of what the board believed the company needed to see. Richard stood frozen at the podium, the composed authority that had carried him through 40 years of difficult negotiations now visibly shaken in front of the exact audience he had spent months trying to reassure. Preston's easy smile faltered for the first time all evening, replaced briefly by something far more desperate before he managed to recover it. Vivian did not stay to watch the fallout unfold in real time. She walked calmly off the terrace, down through the gardens, and out to her car parked along the estate's long circular drive, driving straight to the community kitchen on the east side of the city where Daniel was finishing a late shift restocking shelves for the following morning. She found him exactly where she expected to, and she told him everything that had just happened, still in the gown she had worn to her own unraveling, and Daniel listened with the same steady attention he brought to everything, before telling her, simply, that whatever came next for her father's company or the board's expectations, he was proud of her for finally saying, out loud, the thing she had been carrying silently for months. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We'd love to hear from you. And if this story already has its hooks in you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because what Richard Calloway does in the days following his daughter's public refusal is going to set every remaining piece of this story into motion, and the consequences reach further than either Vivian or Daniel could have anticipated. Richard did not sleep well in the days following the gala. He replayed the moment on that terrace over and over in his mind. The stunned silence of his board members, the visible cracks in Preston's composure, the sight of his own daughter walking calmly away from a plan he had spent months believing served her best interests. He told himself, sitting alone in his study late into the night, that his frustration had nothing to do with any specific man Vivian might have chosen instead, that he would have felt the same unease regardless of who occupied that space in her life, because his fear had never truly been about Preston specifically. It had always been about the same fear that had governed nearly every decision he had made since Margaret's death, the fear of losing the one person left in his life to something sudden and uncontrollable, and somewhere in that grief-hardened logic, controlling every variable in Vivian's life had become the only method he trusted to prevent that loss from repeating itself. He called his longtime head of security, a careful, loyal man named Frank Whitcomb who had worked for the Calloway family for over 15 years, and asked him, in a voice stripped of its usual composure, to quietly look into where exactly his daughter had been disappearing to on the evenings she claimed to be with friends. Frank hesitated, sensing that this request was not quite the ordinary security matter Richard was framing it as. But he had worked for the family long enough to understand that certain instructions were not open for discussion, and within a week, he returned to Richard with a brief, careful report describing a community kitchen on the east side of the city, a volunteer named V who matched his daughter's description exactly, and a man named Daniel Reyes who appeared, from every angle Frank had quietly observed, to be the reason for her repeated visits. Richard sat with that report for a long time in silence, and what troubled him most was not evidence of any wrongdoing, because there was none to speak of. It was the simple, unavoidable recognition that his daughter had built an entire second life quietly, deliberately, in a space he could not see and had never been permitted to enter, and that the man occupying the center of that life was someone entirely outside the carefully curated world Richard had spent decades constructing to keep her safe. He did not confront Vivian directly. He told himself this was because he needed more information first, though some quieter, more honest part of him understood he was avoiding the conversation because he already suspected he would not like whatever answer she gave him. Meanwhile, Preston Hale, watching his carefully built future unravel in real time after the humiliation of the gala, grew increasingly desperate in ways that had nothing to do with genuine affection for Vivian and everything to do with the financial obligations still quietly strangling his private life. He requested a private meeting with Richard, and in that meeting, rather than gracefully accepting Vivian's public refusal, he suggested, carefully and without raising his voice, that perhaps the board's confidence in the company's stability could still be salvaged if the engagement proceeded regardless of Vivian's stated wishes, framing his own desperation as concern for the company's fragile position ahead of the public offering. Richard, still reeling from his daughter's public defiance, found himself uncomfortably tempted by the suggestion, a temptation that revealed, more clearly than anything else, exactly how far his fear of losing control had begun to distort his own judgment. It was Frank Whitcomb, uneasy about the direction Richard's private inquiries had taken, who mentioned quietly to Grace Whitfield, the family's longtime housekeeper and the closest thing Vivian had to a confidant inside that house, that Richard had learned about the kitchen, about Daniel, and that something in Richard's careful, controlled response suggested he was considering a more direct intervention than simple disapproval. Grace, who had watched Vivian grow from a serious, watchful child into a serious, watchful woman, decided, after much internal deliberation, that loyalty to the family sometimes meant warning the person most likely to be hurt by decisions made in her absence, and she found Vivian alone in the garden the following afternoon and told her, gently but plainly, that her father knew about Daniel, and that she should prepare herself for whatever came next. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from tonight. We would genuinely love to hear from you. And if you have not yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because what Richard Calloway decides to do with the knowledge Grace just warned Vivian about is going to become the first real betrayal of this entire story, and nothing that follows will feel the same afterward. Richard's decision, when it finally came, arrived not as a direct confrontation, but as something quieter and, in its own way, far more devastating. Rather than speaking to Vivian himself, he instructed Frank Whitcomb to visit the community kitchen directly and speak with its director, a soft-spoken woman named Pastor Alvarez who had run the kitchen for over a decade on a shoestring budget held together largely by grants and private donations. Frank, uncomfortable with the assignment but unwilling to refuse it, informed Pastor Alvarez, under Richard's explicit instruction, that continued operational funding from a private family foundation the kitchen had quietly relied on for years would depend on certain staffing changes that, without ever naming Daniel directly, made clear exactly which volunteer needed to disappear from the premises if that funding was going to continue. Pastor Alvarez, faced with the impossible choice between the livelihood of an entire kitchen serving dozens of families each week and the presence of a single volunteer, however much she had come to respect him, made the only decision she felt she could make under the circumstances, and she informed Daniel, with visible regret and an apology that clearly cost her something to give, that she could no longer allow him to volunteer at the kitchen going forward. She did not tell him the real reason behind the decision, because Frank had made clear that the funding threat needed to remain invisible, framed instead as a routine reorganization of volunteer roles that had nothing to do with him personally. Daniel, who had learned over 2 difficult years to accept setbacks without complaint, thanked her for her honesty, packed the few tools he kept in a small locker near the kitchen's back door, and left that evening without a single word to Vivian about what had actually happened. Vivian discovered his absence entirely by accident, arriving for her regular shift the following Tuesday to find an unfamiliar volunteer working the station Daniel usually occupied. She asked Pastor Alvarez directly what had happened, and Pastor Alvarez, uncomfortable and clearly holding something back, told her only that certain volunteer arrangements had needed to change, offering no further explanation despite Vivian's repeated, increasingly urgent questions. Vivian left the kitchen that evening with a cold, unsettled feeling moving through her chest, an instinct sharpened by years of watching her father manage every variable in her life without always naming his reasons, and she drove straight to her father's estate, arriving well past dinner, determined to ask him directly whether he had anything to do with Daniel's sudden disappearance from the one place she had come to think of as truly her own. She found Richard in his study, and she asked him plainly, standing across from his desk the way she had rarely stood before him in her entire adult life, whether he had ordered Daniel removed from the kitchen. Richard, caught between the instinct to deny it outright and the discomfort of lying directly to his daughter's face, admitted, finally, that he had arranged the situation through the Family Foundation's funding, framing the decision, as he framed everything, as an act of protection rather than control. The argument that followed was the most severe father and daughter had shared since Margaret's death, both of them raising their voices in ways neither was accustomed to. Vivian accusing her father of treating her like an asset to be managed rather than a daughter to be trusted, Richard insisting, with real anguish beneath his frustration, that he could not bear the thought of losing her to instability, to heartbreak, to any version of a life he could not fully see and control. Vivian left that study that night more shaken than angry, recognizing, for the first time, the true depth of the fear driving her father's every decision, even as she remained entirely unwilling to accept that fear as justification for what he had done. She spent the following days searching for Daniel without success, checking the kitchen, checking the small shelter where she knew he sometimes stayed on the coldest nights, finding no trace of him anywhere she looked, and slowly beginning to understand that a man who had already lost so much once before might have simply decided, quietly, and without confrontation, to disappear from a situation that had cost him something yet again through no fault of his own. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. We would love to hear from you. And if this story already has its hooks in you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because what Vivian finally discovers about where Daniel has gone and what he decides to do next is going to change the entire direction of everything that follows. It took Vivian nearly 2 weeks of quiet searching to finally locate Daniel, a process made harder by the fact that he had deliberately made himself difficult to find, moving between a few different shelters across the city rather than staying anywhere long enough to be easily traced. She found him eventually through Walter, the longtime kitchen volunteer, who admitted, reluctantly, that Daniel had confided in him before leaving that he believed his presence had somehow cost Vivian something significant, and that he intended to step back from her life entirely rather than become the reason her relationship with her father remained permanently broken. Walter gave Vivian the address of a small shelter on the far side of the city, admitting he wasn't entirely certain Daniel was still staying there, but it was the only lead he had. Vivian found him outside that shelter on a cold, overcast evening, sitting on a concrete step with his small collection of belongings beside him. And the moment he saw her, something in his expression shifted between surprise and a carefully guarded kind of hope. He seemed determined not to fully allow himself. She told him everything, that her father had been behind his removal from the kitchen, that she had confronted Richard directly, that she had spent 2 weeks searching for him because she refused to simply let him disappear from her life over a decision that was never his fault to begin with. Daniel listened quietly, and when she finished, he told her that he had left, in part, because he could not bear the thought of being the reason her relationship with the only family she had left continued to fracture. Vivian told him, with a steadiness that surprised them both, that her relationship with her father had been fracturing long before Daniel ever entered her life, built slowly over 9 years of grief-driven control that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with a wound her father had never properly healed. She told Daniel that she did not want him to disappear out of some misguided sense of protecting her, that she wanted, more than she had wanted almost anything else in her adult life, the chance to build something honest with a man who had never once tried to manage or control her, and that whatever it cost her with her father, she was prepared to pay that cost herself. Daniel reached for her hand then, the first time either of them had allowed themselves that simple gesture in the 2 weeks since he had left, and told her that if she was certain, truly certain, he was willing to stay and build something with her, regardless of what world she came from. They were married 3 weeks later, in a small civil ceremony at the county courthouse, with only Walter and Pastor Alvarez present as witnesses, a deliberate, quiet inversion of the gala Richard had once planned to announce her engagement to Preston Hale. Vivian wore a simple dress she had purchased herself, without consulting anyone, and Daniel wore the only suit he owned, carefully pressed for the occasion, his expression steady in the way it always was, though those who knew him well could see the quiet disbelief beneath his composure at how completely his life had changed in the span of a single season. Neither of them told Richard beforehand, understanding instinctively that his presence would have turned the day into another negotiation rather than the simple, honest beginning they both wanted it to be. Richard learned of the marriage 2 days later, from Frank Whitcomb, who had continued quietly monitoring Vivian's movements even after she had specifically asked him to stop. The news landed on Richard with a force that surprised even him, a mixture of anger, grief, and a helplessness he had not felt since the earliest days after Margaret's death, when he had first understood that some losses simply could not be prevented no matter how carefully a man planned around them. He did not call Vivian immediately. He sat alone in his study for hours, staring at a photograph of Margaret on his desk, and for the first time in 9 years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that his relentless need to control every variable in his daughter's life had not protected her at all, but had instead pushed her toward exactly the kind of quiet, permanent distance he had always feared most. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching this from tonight. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because Richard's private reckoning with his own grief was about to be interrupted entirely by a discovery involving Preston Hale, one that would reveal the true depth of the dangers circling the Calloway fortune, and reshape everything Richard believed about the people closest to him. In the weeks following Vivian's marriage, Preston Hale grew increasingly desperate as his private financial obligations reached a breaking point he could no longer manage quietly. Having lost his path to securing the Calloway fortune through marriage, he turned instead to a more direct and far riskier plan, one built on information he had spent months quietly gathering as chief operating officer. Information concerning irregularities in the company's accounting practices dating back several years, discrepancies involving misallocated funds that, if exposed publicly, could seriously damage Richard's reputation and the company's standing ahead of its public offering. Preston understood that this information gave him leverage far more valuable than any marriage arrangement, and he began, carefully, constructing a plan to use it. He requested a private meeting with Richard on a gray, overcast afternoon, and he laid out his findings with a calm, calculated precision, presenting copies of the discrepant records and explaining exactly what would happen to the company's stock price and its thousands of employees if this information reached the board or federal regulators before the public offering was finalized. He framed his proposal not as a threat, but as an opportunity for mutual protection, suggesting that in exchange for his continued silence, he expected to be granted a significantly expanded ownership stake in the company along with guaranteed protection of his position regardless of the outcome of the offering. Richard sat in stunned, controlled silence as Preston spoke, recognizing, with a cold clarity, that this was blackmail dressed carefully in the language of partnership. Richard did not sleep well in the days that followed Preston's ultimatum, and he found himself returning, again and again, to memories of the earliest years of building Calloway Retail Group, decades before the company had grown into anything resembling an empire, back when he had partnered closely with a young accountant named Arthur Reyes, a meticulous, brilliant man who had helped design the very financial systems the company still relied on today. Richard remembered, with a guilt he had buried so deep it had calcified into something almost unrecognizable, a restructuring decision made in the company's early years that had quietly diminished Arthur's formal ownership stake in exchange for a modest settlement, justified at the time as a necessary simplification ahead of the company's first major expansion. Though Richard had known even then that the settlement had never truly reflected what Arthur had actually contributed. It was in searching through old personnel records, attempting to understand the full history behind the accounting discrepancies Preston now held over him, that Richard discovered a detail that stopped him cold in his study late one night. The engineer his own daughter had just married, a man named Daniel Reyes, shared his last name with Arthur Reyes not by coincidence, but because Daniel was in fact Arthur's son, a man whose own father had spent decades of his life quietly written out of the very financial foundation that had made the Calloway fortune possible, a debt Richard had never properly repaid and had, for the most part, spent 30 years trying very hard not to think about too closely. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We would love to hear from you, and if this story already has its hooks in you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because the connection between Richard's buried guilt over Arthur Reyes and his own daughter's marriage to Arthur's son is about to surface in a way that reshapes every relationship in this story at once. Richard sat with this discovery for several days before he found the courage to act on it, turning the full weight of the coincidence over in his mind again and again. The son of the man he had quietly wronged decades earlier, now married to the daughter he had spent 9 years trying desperately to protect. He thought of the bridge failure Daniel had once described in passing to Vivian, the cost-cutting decision made without his knowledge that had ended his career, and something in Richard's memory stirred uncomfortably, a recollection of Calloway Retail's own business relationship with the engineering firm involved in that very project years earlier. A relationship that had pressured for cheaper materials on several contracts without Richard ever fully tracing where those pressures ultimately landed. He called his longtime attorney, a careful and thorough man named Walter Briggs who had served the Calloway family for over 20 years, and asked him to quietly investigate the full history of the bridge project Daniel had once worked on, along with any connection between that project's engineering firm and Calloway Retail's own business dealings during that period. Walter Briggs returned within a week with findings that confirmed Richard's worst suspicion, that the cost-cutting materials substitution, which caused the bridge failure, had in fact originated from pressure applied by a mid-level executive at the engineering firm, a young, ambitious man who had at the time been quietly courting favor with several of Calloway Retail's senior leadership, a man who Richard now realized, with a sinking recognition, was none other than Preston Hale himself, decades before he had ever risen to chief operating officer. Richard called Preston into his study once more, and this time, rather than considering the terms of Preston's blackmail, he informed him plainly that he understood exactly where the original bridge failure had come from, and exactly whose career had been quietly sacrificed to protect the reputation of the firm Preston had worked for at the time. He told Preston that he intended to bring the entire history to the board himself, the accounting discrepancies, the original bridge failure, and Preston's role in both, before Preston ever had the chance to use any of it against him. Preston's composure cracked for the first time since Richard had known him, his careful precision giving way to something far more desperate as he realized his leverage was evaporating in real time, and he attempted, briefly and unsuccessfully, to argue that exposing any of it would damage Richard just as severely as it would damage him. Richard, meeting his gaze steadily, told him that he had spent 30 years allowing convenience and fear to keep him from correcting wrongs he had always known were wrongs, first with Arthur Reyes, and now, indirectly, with Arthur's son, and that he refused to let a second betrayal compound the first simply to protect his own comfort any longer. The formal board meeting convened 8 days later, and Richard stood before it delivering not the polished, defensive statement his advisors had urged him to prepare, but a full, unflinching account of the company's early history, Arthur Reyes's essential contributions, the diminished settlement that had never reflected his true value to the company, and Preston's own role in the bridge failure that had destroyed Daniel's career years later. Preston was removed from his position immediately once the board understood the full extent of his attempted blackmail, and what little sympathy remained for him in that room evaporated entirely once the bridge failure connection came to light. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching this from tonight. We would love to hear from you, and if you haven't yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because what Richard does next, in the quiet aftermath of that board meeting, is going to determine whether he can finally earn back the trust of the daughter whose forgiveness matters more to him than the empire he just risked everything to protect honestly. Richard sought out Daniel directly, 3 days after the board meeting concluded, driving himself to the small apartment Vivian and Daniel had recently moved into together, arriving unannounced without any assistant accompanying him, dressed plainly in a way that made him look, for the first time in years, less like the founder of a national retail empire, and more like an ordinary man carrying an apology he had waited far too long to deliver. Daniel answered the door, and the two men stood facing each other for a long moment, the weight of two intertwined family histories passing silently between them before either spoke a single word. Richard did not offer excuses. He told Daniel, standing there in the doorway, that his father, Arthur Reyes, had been one of the most brilliant and meticulous men he had ever worked alongside, and that Richard had spent 3 decades allowing cowardice dressed up as practicality to keep him from properly correcting a debt he had always known was owed. He told Daniel about the formal acknowledgement now being filed into the company's official history, restoring Arthur's name and contributions to the record in a way they had never been fully credited before, and about a substantial settlement being arranged in Arthur's memory, though he made clear, standing there with a humility entirely unlike the confident authority Daniel had heard described by Vivian, that he understood no amount of money could undo 30 years of silence, and that he was not there seeking forgiveness so much as finally telling the truth aloud to the one person who deserved to hear it most directly. He also told Daniel, with visible difficulty, that he now understood the bridge failure that had ended his career had originated from Preston Hale's own actions decades earlier, and that the company would be working to formally clear Daniel's professional record and restore his engineering license through every available channel. Daniel listened without interrupting. The years of quiet, dignified endurance he had carried since losing his career, now reshaped entirely by everything Richard had just told him. When Richard finished speaking, Daniel told him, quietly, that he appreciated the honesty, that he needed time to fully absorb everything he had just learned about his father's true history with the company, but that he was not interested in holding on to bitterness the same way he suspected his father never fully learned to release. Richard nodded, accepting this without argument, and told him only that he would wait as long as it took, that there was no more urgency left in him now, only a genuine desire to finally get something right after decades of getting it wrong in ways he had spent too long refusing to examine. Vivian did not accompany her father on that visit, understanding instinctively that this particular reckoning belonged to the 2 men alone, but she found Daniel later that same evening standing quietly on their small apartment balcony, the city lights spreading out below them, and she asked him gently how the conversation had gone. Daniel told her everything, his father's true history with the company, the bridge failure's real origin, Richard's genuine humility in delivering all of it, and Vivian listened with tears she did not try to hide, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that her father had finally chosen honesty over control, even when honesty cost him something significant. Before we reach the end of this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We would love to hear from you, and if you haven't yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because the final chapter of Vivian and Daniel's story together is one you will not want to miss. In the months that followed, Daniel's engineering license was fully reinstated after a formal review confirmed the bridge failure had originated from materials substitutions ordered above his authority, and he returned to work as a consulting structural engineer on public infrastructure projects. His name finally cleared in every professional record that had once carried his disgrace. Richard, without seeking any public credit for the gesture, quietly helped fund a scholarship in Arthur Reyes's name at the local engineering college, ensuring that students from working families would have access to the kind of opportunity his own father never received full credit for creating. Preston Hale's downfall played out publicly and appropriately in the months following the board meeting. His role in both the accounting discrepancies and the original bridge failure ending his career in the industry entirely, though Richard, to his credit, pursued no further personal vendetta beyond what the truth itself had already cost him. Vivian, in the aftermath of everything that had happened, made her own quiet decision about her future within Calloway Retail Group, choosing to step away from the pressure of eventual full ownership and instead take over leadership of the company's charitable foundation, a role she found herself genuinely passionate about in a way she had never once felt about board meetings or quarterly earnings reports. She and Daniel settled into a modest, ordinary life together that looked nothing like the world she had grown up inside, and everything like the honest life she had quietly been searching for since long before she ever knew his name. Grace Whitfield, the family's longtime housekeeper, often remarked afterward that she had never seen Vivian laugh so freely as she did in the small kitchen of the apartment she shared with Daniel, a lightness that had been entirely absent throughout all those years inside the grand rooms of the Calloway estate. Nearly a year after their courthouse wedding, Richard hosted a small gathering at the estate. Nothing like the lavish gala he had once planned for Vivian's engagement to Preston Hale, but something quieter, warmer, attended only by people who genuinely mattered to the family rather than board members and investors. Richard stood to give a brief toast during that gathering, his voice steady but softened by something new, something humbled, entirely different from the confident, controlling tone that had once defined nearly every word he spoke to his daughter. He told the small group gathered that he had spent much of his life believing that protecting the people he loved meant controlling every variable around them, and that it had taken losing sight of his daughter's trust, confronting a debt 30 years overdue, and watching a man with almost nothing show more integrity than most people he had done business with his entire career, to finally understand that real protection meant telling the truth even when it cost him everything he once believed he needed to keep. He looked at Daniel as he said this, and something passed between the two men that required no further words, an understanding built slowly over the preceding months through quiet dinners and careful conversations, the patient work of rebuilding trust between two families whose histories had been unfairly tangled together decades before either Vivian or Daniel had been born. As the evening settled into dusk, Vivian and Daniel stood together near the same terrace where she had once refused an engagement she never wanted, and Richard, watching his daughter laugh freely in a way he had rarely seen at any of the formal events he once arranged on her behalf, felt something in his chest finally settle after 9 long years of grief and control and fear, a quiet, hard-won peace that no amount of money or empire building had ever managed to provide him. Some inheritances, he thought, standing there in the fading light, are stolen, buried, and denied for decades before the truth finally forces its way back into the light. And some inheritances, the ones that matter most in the end, are not built from fortune at all, but earned back patiently, honestly, one difficult choice at a time, exactly the way Arthur Reyes had once tried to build his own quiet legacy, and exactly the way his son now stood ready to build his, this time with a family who finally understood that real love, unlike control, cannot be arranged from a study behind a closed door, but only earned, slowly and honestly, in the open. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because we have many more stories just like this one waiting for you, and we would hate for you to miss a single one of them.